This is Lisa Miller and Associates, Florida Insurance Roundup, your podcast on the people, issues, and regulations shaping Florida's insurance market. Now, here's Lisa Miller.
Welcome, friends, to the Florida Insurance Roundup. As always, we're bringing you the conversations that matter most at the intersection of insurance, disaster recovery, and public policy with real-world impacts. We've all been reading for several years now that losses from natural catastrophes around the globe and here in the U.S. and Florida have reached unprecedented levels, and I often joke that these storms are not your grandmother's storms anymore. The average losses over the past 5 years are $132 billion with a B. We did a podcast recently on how that increase is due to so-called, quote, frequency perils. Frequent events such as the daily afternoon thunderstorms that we see in June and July that are driving high impact losses. In the insurance industry, those events are called severe convective storms, and you'll hear the abbreviation SCS events. But what if I told you that the weather and climate factors played a relatively small part, 10% to 20% of those loss costs? And that the biggest cost drivers, a whopping 80% to 90%, were linked to non-hazard factors. That's the conclusion reached by experts at Gallagher Re, the global reinsurance broker, in what I think is an extraordinary report that was just released. Researchers at Gallagher Re found that price spikes over the past 18 years in oil, of course, used in asphalt roof shingles, along with increases in other construction materials, plus labor cost, and a stubbornly stuck consumer price index have led to higher replacement costs for insurance companies. Also playing a role, claims litigation, including assignment of benefits contracts between repair vendors and homeowners, and social inflation. And we've all heard about this in Florida. And to this day, despite the law changes outlawing assignment of benefits, I still get emails and calls at my office about consumers who were duped into signing some kind of contract they didn't know what they were signing. Today on the Florida Insurance Roundup podcast, we have two great guests to flesh out these results and their practical implications on property insurance companies and consumers. Steve Bowen is here today, and he's the researcher behind this Gallagher report. He is their chief science officer and also a meteorologist. And Steve is part of the Gallagher Research Center that provides innovative risk research and insights that drive solutions across Gallagher Re's global insurance and reinsurance services. Steve, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Also with us is Ryan Hodges with American Integrity Insurance Company, headquartered in beautiful Tampa, Florida. Ryan is the Senior Vice President of Risk Management for American Integrity, which is one of the top 5 property insurance writers in Florida with nearly 400,000 policyholders. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. Delighted to join the conversation and look forward to getting into the topic here.
Wonderful. So, Steve, I'm going to start with you and ask you what moved you to start studying and pondering these non-hazard factors?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've just seen, not just in Florida, not just in the U.S., but globally, we've just seen this continuation of losses becoming more expensive. And, we do a ton of studying on the hazard side, of course, trying to get a sense of, how the atmosphere is changing, how we're seeing changes in terms of ocean temperatures and how that can lead to greater implications of weather patterns and leading to more unusual types of weather, which of course there is a climate change component. But when you're looking at the overall frequency of events, there's not really any data that suggests that we're seeing an overall increase in the number of the events themselves. Now, of course, we're starting to see some emerging signs of, on a per event basis, that events are behaving a bit more erratically, or there's more volatility than what we've seen before in the past. But it wasn't enough of an obvious signal for us to feel like this is really what's driving why losses continue to go up. So a lot of the themes that we discussed and you covered in your opening are not necessarily brand new items. I think most folks are generally aware of this, but we really wanted to look under the hood and try to figure out why 2008. And so when you're talking about thunderstorms in general, that was the first year which we topped $10 billion in the US for insured thunderstorm related losses. Now, if you go back in time, 18 years, nearly 20 years ago, $100 billion aggregate, nat cat insured loss year was still a pretty big deal. We only really had seen that in 2005. And the fact that thunderstorms, what's considered, a non-primary peril, and we can certainly get into that further in the discussion about how I feel about that bucketing. But thinking of thunderstorms as a secondary peril, but it actually drove more than $10 billion of loss. At the time, that did raise a lot of eyebrows. And the question was, is this going to continue? And not only did it continue, we're now at a point within the last 3 years where we've surpassed $50 billion per year for the thunderstorm peril just in the US alone. And so that 10 billion back in 2008 now looks like the good old days, right? But we really wanted to kind of figure out what was the driving factor in 2008 that really has caused this, frankly, almost linear rate of growth for the peril that we've seen over the last nearly 20 years. And when you do a really deep dive in terms of what's driving this, what are the non-hazard factors driving it, it becomes pretty clear that while yes, of course, there is a weather/climate component to all of this, the influence is not nearly as dramatic as it is on the non-hazard factors around these bigger socioeconomic and macroeconomic factors.
So, Ryan, you've heard the expert talk about these, and he's, dug his heart into this. How do you, as a primary insurance company, mitigate these non-hazard factors? What's it doing to your rate calculations? How do your actuaries feel about it? I'm just curious.
So first of all, I think, the report itself is very valuable, and it's a great insight into really what the risk is in total. I mean, obviously there's a portion of the risk that is going to be driven by the hazard, but obviously as we're thinking about, how we're pricing our products and what different things we need to include in that pricing algorithm, it's something we should consider, these exterior factors as well, or stuff that's not often thought about kind of in the same breath as severe convective storms. So I think that causes us to go through and certainly understand the risk for that particular peril, whether it's severe convective storm, and you could argue some of this would apply to hurricanes as well when you think about labor costs and the construction materials and things like that. But from the carrier side, we've got to be keeping up with those trends. I think, it's always, is this something we can control? I'm not sure we can control some of the cost in this, but I think when we're looking at our own book, we have to have, replacement cost metrics and things to evaluate. Is the insurance that we're providing, are we considering those things? Are we changing as those prices change? And what impact that's going to have on the rate and eventually the premium?
So, Ryan, if I'm you as a chief risk officer for American Integrity, do we monitor? We've got our war in Iran. We've got oil prices through the roof, which of course are part of these non-hazard factors because of the asphalt shingle needs using oil. Do we try to educate our policyholders, Ryan, and explain to them the risk where they live, how this can affect them? Do you think it's just a nuance they won't understand? If you were sitting in front of your grandmother, what would you say about this, Ryan?
So yeah, I think to the degree that we can explain the risk and where it is. I mean, I think coming from a Florida carrier, it's not to say that severe convective storms don't happen here, because they do. But if I was to sit in front of my grandmother, it's easy to explain to her, hey, if you live on the water, you have a higher chance of getting hit by a hurricane. If you live further inland, it's going to be probably a little less. And then, I think it becomes a complicated discussion because you don't want to, you want to make sure you frame it in a way that they understand it. But I think continuing to talk with the insurers, continuing to talk with our agent force, on all of these exterior factors that are contributing to not only the premium that we're charging, but obviously we have expense kind of ourselves, whether it's reinsurance or other things. I think that's important that we consider all these factors and we talk about all the different segments. And I guess that's probably the best way I can think about it, is all the different segments that would make up how you get to eventually a premium number that you're charging for a risk or for a policy.
Excellent. Thank you. That's very helpful. And Steve, throwing it back to you, your report has a section called Housing Growth Rate and Urbanization. Share with the audience whether that also includes more people living in some of the riskiest areas of Florida and in the country. Kind of share with us a summary or synopsis of that section. It was a great part of the report.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's pretty simple. I mean, human beings are addicted to risk. We love moving into the high risk areas, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's Florida when it comes to hurricane risk, whether it's Texas or Oklahoma, or even here, I live in Chicago and Illinois, right? I mean, we know that every year there is going to be some level of thunderstorm related risk, but people are moving into these areas anyways. And so, again, regardless of whether or not we see an increase in the frequency of events, but if you're putting more people into urbanized areas, and frankly, it's not just directly into city centers. I mean, you look at the aftermath of COVID. I mean, we're still seeing people are moving further and further away from city centers, and frankly, it leads to what we call the expansion of the bullseye, right? And so, what that is meaning to say is that you can have a same size hail swath from 10 years ago that traverses the same areas, but where there may have just been a lot of nothing, there's now properties that are in harm's way. And you don't necessarily need to have a complete loss of a structure to lead to significant losses, right? I mean, if you have more and more properties under the footprint that do get affected, even a partial amount of loss can aggregate to a really high number really quickly. And when we're talking about Florida specifically, I mean, the first storm that comes into mind, and I'm sure Ryan will agree with me, is Hurricane Irma, right? I mean, Irma went up basically the spine of the state. The highest winds, were pretty well concentrated to the center part of the state. But I mean, I have family that still live in the Tampa area, and they had damage to our pool enclosure. And it took a really, really long time to get that thing fixed, right? And it's because it was just sheer volume. There were just so many other properties that had minor damage, but you run into supply chain concerns, you run into labor shortage issues, and all of these factors, when you put them together, that's just going to lead to higher rebuild costs, right? So the urbanization piece and more people moving into harm's way and known locations where we're going to see these types of perils, when you put all the other non-hazard factors together on top of it, it just really leads to greater risk, and it translates to higher losses that we've continued to see over the last couple of decades.
So we have a lot of headwinds in the area of trying to convince people uh, to stay out of harm's way. Yesterday, this would be for those listening to this podcast at a later date, it would have been May 7th. The FEMA Review Council discussion, and our show notes will have a link to that 90-minute discussion, talked about what are known as severe losses or severe repetitive losses, which are, of course, homes that over and over again get flooded. This is in relation to the National Flood Insurance Program. And I think what you're saying, Steve, is that we've got to try to reverse the course. And in terms of what Ron faces as well with being a primary insurance company, as you said, we're addicted to risk, Steve. We love these beautiful areas that are the highest risk of anywhere in the country in Florida. And that's what's costing and driving so many of these rates. Ryan, is there a way that you can tell us about building codes and resilience and what American Integrity views as efficient or effective building codes and resilience efforts for people that do have these risky homes, and what it means for them to make their homes windworthy or floodworthy, and what you feel about that?
I mean, my opinion is Florida probably has some of the best building codes in the nation. I think there are a lot of other states that either look to Florida or are trying to do their own thing and make homes more resilient. But I think that's really what it comes down to. One, you've got to have really good building codes, and it's got to be engineer from an engineering perspective. It needs to be a sound structure. But I think you also have to have enforcement of those codes, which Florida actually does really well. We're also writing business outside of Florida, and as we start to expand, we do see that the enforcement side of things doesn't always work out exactly how we hope. But I think as you're looking in, kind of coming back to Florida, if you're in these areas that are going to flood a lot, and they've been known to flood historically, even more recently with Helene and Milton, I think one of the biggest things in a flood prone area you can do is elevate the homes. Now, obviously, if it's an older home that's already built, that's very expensive. There's a cost of living in paradise, is what people have told me before. And so I think when you look at that from a flood perspective, it's about elevating the home to something that makes sense. So if you think about the wind side, we saw really good performance in our new construction book, which we write a lot of new construction in the state of Florida. We saw the performance of those homes was very good in Helene and Milton because they were built to code, they were inspected properly. So I think as those codes continue to evolve, we need to look at those and figure out what's working and what's not. But I do think that that's the other thing that we would stress to homeowners and to insureds is if you're in an area that is a little bit more risky, you need to make sure you've got the proper risk mitigation around the house. I mean, one of the things, if we look kind of outside of Florida, is the IBHS does a lot of work on the wind side and fire. But for this discussion on the wind side, right, they have the Fortified Home Program, and I think a lot of that research that they've done on those homes that are IBHS certified really perform well. I think it becomes a bit of a problem, right? Yes, they're better homes. The risk mitigation is great, but they're more expensive. So I think that's part of the limiting factor in some cases. But I think for these homes that are going to be more coastal, and even maybe it should go a little further inland as well. I mean, there's a case to be made that there should be other areas that have a higher standard. But I think that's one thing that has to be considered when we're looking at the risk, and it's something I think Florida has done very well. But we can't just stop because we've done it well historically. We have to keep doing that and building better structures as we go forward.
So, an idea that former Senator Jeff Brandes, who is the leader of the Florida Policy Project, in a recent op-ed, as they're called, that will be published in upcoming newspapers, is that the legislature should provide incentives. We already have the wind mitigation discounts, as we know in Florida. We know that very well, and those are in flux right now here as we are in the spring of 2026. Doesn't mean that they won't be finalized soon, the new credits. But Senator Brandes, as we call him, even though he's not currently in office, is recommending that the legislature provide incentives specifically for roofs, specifically for metal roofs and the underlayment underneath those roofs. And that would get us away from asphalt shingles and, of course, a non-hazard cost that we're talking about with the oil and the shingles, et cetera. Steve, I'll throw it back to you. Do you know of any other developed country that uses asphalt shingles, or are we behind the curve in the United States? What is out there in the world that we could try to reduce some of these factors and these cost drivers with, say, perhaps different roof coverings? You done anything thoughts about that, Steve?
Well, when it comes to asphalt shingle, I mean, there's no question the U.S. is king. I mean, we use asphalt shingles more than almost any other place on earth. It's really become a part of our DNA, and a lot of it just comes down to cost, right? I mean, it tends to be a much cheaper option, and people have to go that route. I mean, you just talking about the state of Florida and possibly putting this piece of legislation on the table, which I think is great from an incentivization standpoint. And I also would say, just looking in Louisiana, where Louisiana actually has a tax rebate, essentially a process that's set up where if you spend up to $10,000 to improve your roof or the structural integrity of your home to be better prepared, you'll actually be able to write that off on your taxes, right? And that's a really good first step. Now, the issue is always, and this is not just a U.S. issue, but it's international as well. It's do you have enough of the population that does have the funds available to be able to spend the money up front? And that's really where there's a lot of challenge that comes to this point. But going back to the original question about asphalt shingle, I mean, yeah, I mean, we look at other countries where metal certainly is a much more common building type, or you get more of the tile shingle, which of course, you do see a number of that, the Spanish tile in Florida, but you do see that overseas a lot. So, I think that there are certainly good opportunities to look elsewhere to see where there are cheap options, but also really effective options that can come to the country. But at the end of the day, the real challenge is going to be, how do you get the construction industry on board to change what has long been the norm? And that's where some of the more difficult conversations have to come into play. And I think the bigger question is whether it's going to require something coming from state legislatures to really kind of force the issue about rethinking whether the traditional norms of just defaulting to using that asphalt shingle is the way to go. And there's a lot of really difficult discussions that are going to have to be had, not dissimilar to kind of where we allow people to build. If we know it's a repetitive loss property, I mean, do we keep allowing people to build in the same place and having to go through the same cycle of rebuilding or fixing damage several times over the course of a decade or two? So, yeah.
Love it. Thank you for that. The insurance commissioner and members of the Institute for Business and Home Safety and others believe in January or February of 2025 did a panel session about roof coverings and underlayments. And so that's probably a subject of another podcast. But the research, of course, is clear that, having and not felt, I mean, no offense to our people that make roof felt, but that's your grandmother's underlayment. Having a stronger underlayment, so if something does happen to the roof covering, it makes all the difference in the world. And so we will talk about that at a future podcast. And for any of our listeners that want to weigh in about that, we'd love to hear that as well. So now here's the big question. Often in our industry, we use terms that make no sense. I often laugh about inland marine policies, which have nothing to do, and I think, with boats. It's like jewelry floaters and that kind of thing. So here's another curveball, and I want to throw this to Steve and then have Ryan answer it. The terms, perils, they're classified as primary, secondary, peak versus non-peak. Today, Steve, I want you to set the record straight. What's good about those terms? What's not good? What could we change? And then I'll have Ryan react to it because he's got to live with that terminology as a primary insurer. Steve?
Yeah, hopefully Ryan isn't going to hate me after I say all this, but I think it's pretty clear if you've followed my writing or my career over the last decade. I am not the biggest fan of how we currently use the bucketing of primary and secondary peril. The big reason for that is if you just look at the loss data itself, if you're talking about thunderstorm losses, it's actually been more expensive on an aggregate basis over the last 20 to 25 years for the insurance industry than it has been for hurricane. And I'll repeat that. Thunderstorms on an aggregate basis have actually been more expensive than hurricanes over the last 20 to 25 years. And that's a pretty remarkable statement to make. But if we're talking about traditional terminology, we still say that, a tropical cyclone is a primary peril and severe convective storms are secondary. Now, if you're looking at the pure definition of secondary, it means it's inherently not as important as a primary or first level peril. And if you talk to the industry, I mean, you're going to get a very strong opinion in the other direction. So from my perspective, and I would say from Gallagher's perspective as well, is we like to really boil this down to a specific client's book by itself, right? So if you're talking to a Midwest writer, for instance, who doesn't have any coastal exposure, and you tell them that, well, you're having a really tough time with thunderstorm loss, but it's secondary. It's a secondary peril. These are the things that are getting worse. And they say, well, wait a minute. I mean, this is my primary area of focus. So our preference is to talk on a client by client basis and walk them through what their portfolio risk looks like. and then help them really decide if they want to, use the primary, secondary bucketing, but actually make it bespoke, so it's accurately covering what they're actually needing to face. So that would certainly be my preference in terms of how we look at these perils moving forward, because it's not a one size fits all approach. It's going to be different everywhere. And same discussion with my European colleagues, where we talk about European windstorm being a primary peril, but if you compare it to the actual loss performance for these carriers and reinsurers over the last, again, 20 years or so, I mean, it's been thunderstorms and it's been flooding. It really hasn't been the windstorm peril. So we're having the same discussion across the pond about what truly should be bucketed as a primary or secondary or peak or non-peak peril. But it really ends up depending more on the individual client more than anything else.
Okay, Ron, you got the last word.
Well, in this case, no, I actually agree with Steve. I've never been a big fan of putting, okay, this is primary or secondary or whatever, because to me it gives the value of less importance. And I do think you have to look at it kind of client by client. Each company needs to look at it for themselves, because even if you want to say, okay, well, typically this peril has been secondary. I mean, the reality is, we could still have a massive storm, severe convective storm in Florida. We could still have as dry as it's been here in the past probably year, certainly 6 months. We could have a really damaging fire, and something, say in Orlando where it's densely populated, or something, somewhere in the southeast portion of the state around Miami or Palm Beach or something like that, could have massive implications and massive loss for the industry. So I think it's very important that, okay, we can say, yeah, we think on a year-to-year basis we're probably going to get, it's a higher chance we're going to get more losses from hurricanes, things like that. But we can't just dismiss everything else. We need to understand that, hey, there is a still real possibility. The probability is not zero that something could still be very impactful from these other perils. And so I think it's good to keep everything in check, never get too high or too low on what we think the risk is, but just consider it holistically, because it really still only takes one event to make you see, oh, we thought about that incorrectly. And I don't want to fall into that. Just because we haven't seen losses from those perils maybe in a big way before doesn't mean we're not going to see them going forward.
Well, you heard it here, folks. We're going to do a vocabulary lesson. It sounds like maybe need to do some retraining on vocabulary, and would love to hear your commentary, those of you that are listening today, about these very issues that affect everything in reinsurance, primary insurance, consumers, agents, contractors, builders, developers. My dream before I don't want to use the word retire, before I decide to do something even more fun than I do now, was to put everybody around the table over a cup of coffee and a piece of apple pie, as we say in the South, and solve these issues about how we can make things better overall among the different industries that we all work in. I want to thank you, Steve. Steve Bowen is the Chief Science Officer at Gallagher Re, and he's very prolific. You want to follow his work, I highly recommend that you do that. Gallagher Re, the third largest reinsurance broker in the world, and I am grateful to be one of their good consultants and help them every step of the way, and we are great partners. Steve, I follow your work. You're a great researcher. You ask the tough questions. It's always insightful. I see you in conferences preaching the good word in panel sessions, et cetera. So keep up the great work, and thank you for always asking the question of why. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.
And Ryan, always a pleasure. Senior Vice President Ryan Hodges of Risk Management with American Integrity Insurance Company. American Integrity was my very first client in 2007 when they opened their doors in March of 2007. Recently went public. They do what's right, and it's great to have them as a partner and a client. And they are growing fast and furiously, even outside of Florida. Ryan, you've got your hands full. So thanking you so much today for taking the time to be on our show today.
Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate it. Steve, always good to talk to you as well.
This podcast has been enlightening for me, and I hope for you as our listening audience. Ultimately, the risk landscape is evolving on a global US and Florida basis. In some cases, Risk is increasing, while in others it may be stabilizing or decreasing. It depends on the peril and the region. What may be primary risk in Florida may not be so in other places. Let's say Kansas, where I often joke there's only 5 homes, and vice versa. It's not a one size fits all events risk world anymore. To be clear, this does not dismiss emerging changes that we're increasingly seeing with storm behavior. Remember, I said at the beginning of this podcast, these storms are not your grandmother's storms, but it's not the primary driver of the loss cost increase we've been seeing over the past 18 years, and especially in the last 5 years, thanks to Steve and Gallagher Re's research. This weather that we are experiencing in our lifetimes has its ups and downs. We know that the storms, the weather, we hear extreme events. That's a term that's frequently used. We all know it. We all see it. To see that storm that hit Jamaica, people were joking that it was a category 6. That's no joke. But the cost associated with the severity of these storms, they continue to climb. They impact the availability and affordability of property insurance overall. And per this Gallagher Re report that you'll see in our show notes, most of the rise can be explicitly tied to macroeconomic and socioeconomic drivers. We're grateful to our good friends at Gallagher Re, whose specialists combine deep sector insight with local expertise to help our best insurance companies like American Integrity navigate complexity and be resilient. So, again, in our podcast show notes, we'll make sure you have a synopsis of today's conversation along with the report that we've talked about done by Gallagher Re and Steve Bowen and his great team. We'll also link the FEMA Review Council report where you can flip through it and see how there's the intersection between emergency management, disaster recovery, and insurance, and the intersection of those in that report. And of course, I'm always anxious to hear your perspective. Those of us that have talked before, I appreciate you calling me and emailing me after we do podcast. It gives me great perspective. And I'd love to know from you, what can we do to improve Florida's property insurance marketplace? Should the legislature provide incentives, something similar to what Louisiana is doing, though we don't have a state income tax? But what is it that we can do to get our residents, as we say in the South, in the mitigation and resilience game? You can call us and leave a comment for our later reply at 850-388-8002. That's 850-388-8002. Or send me an email, Lisa Miller, all one word, at lisamillerassociates.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please be sure to subscribe and share it with a colleague, and find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. Share the good news of our newsletter that we provide free of charge. We've been doing that about 15 years and have thousands of readers. We just love to stay in touch with you, and you can find all of this at my website, www.lisamillerassociates.com. To close, we are bringing you the conversations that matter the most. And if you've got topics that you're interested in, we'd love to host those topics and the experts surrounding them. That's it for today's Florida Insurance Roundup. Thank you for being a part of it. And remember, at Lisa Miller & Associates, we have a passion for public policy and client success. I'm Lisa Miller, and until next time, stay safe, Florida.
This has been Lisa Miller & Associates Florida Insurance Roundup, your podcast on the people, issues, and regulations shaping Florida's insurance market. For more information on today's program, please visit us on the web at www.lisamillerassociates.com.